What if Ginny Weasley was sorted into Slytherin? What if she became the first Weasley to not be a Gryffindor? How would that impact her relationship with her family? How would it impact her relationship with Harry? And what other changes would it make to the Harry Potter series as a whole? Let's dive in and find out. So if Ginny Weasley wasn't sorted into Gryffindor, which other house would be the obvious choice for her? She's ambitious, she's resourceful, she's strong-willed, that's for sure. I think she'd be a good fit for Slytherin. We see multiple examples through the series where traits that could see Ginny fitting into Slytherin house are on display for all to see. She's ambitious. We hear her use the phrase, anything's possible if you've got enough nerve. She says that in the Order of the Phoenix, and it feels like a very Slytherin phrase. Plus, she goes on to become the Queen of Quidditch. She shows plenty of cunning through the series as well. For example, Mrs. Weasley catches her using dung bombs, and when she asks about it, Ginny blames Crookshanks. Blaming a cat who can't defend themselves feels very Slytherin, don't you think? She shows leadership, both in her role in the Gryffindor Quidditch team and in leading the rebellion in the Deathly Hallows. Plus, to overcome being possessed by Voldemort when you're 11 years old and then go on to become one of the strongest, fiercest, most popular and able witches at Hogwarts, that shows resourcefulness. Ginny has everything required to be a Slytherin. And then think what her being in Slytherin would do to the plot. First, the dynamic of a Weasley in Slytherin would be so interesting by itself. And I know in the first draft of the Goblet of Fire, apparently the idea was to have a Weasley cousin in Slytherin, so it was an idea that was always floating around. But secondly, we needed a Slytherin character who was a bit more favourable way earlier in the series. Because until Slughorn comes along, pretty much all the Slytherins are just out and out awful. We have 5 books of Slytherin being represented by Draco Malfoy, who bullies people, calls them mudbloods, mocks people's dead parents, and reveres his father for being a Death Eater. And also Severus Snape, who was a Death Eater, and also mocked and ridiculed literal children when he's their teacher. So a favourable Slytherin like Ginny earlier in the series would have been much, much better for the story and for the representation of Slytherin house. And third, the heir of Slytherin plot would have been so much more interesting if Ginny was in fact in Slytherin's own house. And finally, the extra conflict in Harry having feelings for Ginny if she was in Slytherin just brings an extra dynamic to that whole relationship. We're going to cover all of those points and more later on in the video in more depth. But the point is, Ginny fits Slytherin, and the plot would have been better for it. But exactly how would her time at Hogwarts have played out? So Ginny rocks up to the Hogwarts sorting ceremony in the Chamber of Secrets. Harry and Ron miss it because of the whole flying car incident. So then imagine when they get to the dorm and Ron asks where Ginny is, and Fred and George and Hermione have to break it to him that actually she was sorted into Slytherin. I'll come on to how the siblings will react to this in the next part of the video, but I don't think Ron reacts very well to that at all. But from Ginny's perspective, Ginny is already very, very shy anyway at this point. Even when she's sorted into Gryffindor, she feels like an outcast, so imagine if she wasn't. Plus, she's about to have the toughest first year maybe anybody has at Hogwarts in the history of the school. So at this point, not only is she the only girl in a family of 6 other brothers, but she's also the only Slytherin in a family of Gryffindors. Already, we've got more about her character than there was in the movies, at least. And in the Chamber of Secrets, she's already withdrawn and sheepish and shy in her interactions with Harry anyway. First because she has a crush on him, but also because she secretly opened the Chamber of Secrets and set a basilisk on a bunch of Muggleborns. But her being a Slytherin adds another dynamic to some parts of the Chamber of Secrets that are already vital to the plot. For example, when she wants to come clean to Harry about everything, but then Percy comes along and so she gets a bit awkward and shy and runs off. The excuse that she's awkward because she's been put into Slytherin and she feels like an outcast, it already compounds. It compounds all of the things we already get from her character. Plus, it's another aspect of why she might spill her soul out to Tom Riddle's diary. We'll come to that in depth later in the video as well, because so many more things happen when it comes to Tom Riddle's diary now that Ginny's in Slytherin. So Ginny's relationship with her siblings will no doubt change if she's a Slytherin, most notably with Ron. Because Ron is sort of proven through the series to be quite closed-minded and set in his ways. We see it when he talks about giants, when he talks about werewolves, when he talks about goblins. These unconscious biases that sort of find their way into his opinions that he never questions. And so because of these biases he has about Slytherin, I think his relationship with Ginny in the first couple of years would be quite strained. He'd start to lump her in with the likes of Draco Malfoy. Maybe he'd stop talking anytime she approached the trio around Hogwarts. I really think he would struggle with her being a Slytherin the most. And so I think Ron struggles the most because of those biases, but also because he's the youngest of all of her siblings, and he's the least emotionally mature, as Hermione later points out.
Just because you've got the emotional range of a teaspoon.
Fred and George would probably just sort of laugh it off, make a few jokes, maybe insensitively given how much Ginny would be struggling with it, but ultimately I don't think they'd care that much. They'd just be fine with it. And I can even see them making a joke about Ginny when the Chamber of Secrets is first opened, like, oh, Ginny's a Slytherin, suddenly the chamber's opened, without realising the weight to that joke. And when it comes to Percy, he seems very by and for the system. And so I don't think he'd be that reductionist about the sorting system or the houses. I think he'd just put weight behind some of the Slytherins that he admires and list them. Like, oh, Ginny's in Slytherin, so was Merlin, that's fine. He'd tell Ron that his view on Slytherins was too simplistic. And so the rest of the Weasleys who aren't at Hogwarts, I think, they'd be fine mostly. There would maybe be this slight undertone that she's the first Weasley to not be a Gryffindor, but ultimately that would be overpowered by their love for her. Molly would probably be more worried than disappointed that she was alone in Slytherin without her brothers to back her up, given how shy she is to begin with. But Ginny, being an awkward 11-year-old girl with lots of insecurities, she'd focus on these awkward moments. She'd take Fred and George's jokes to heart, and she'd struggle with Ron's reaction. And that would really feed into her relationship with the entire trio. Ginny, by the end of the series, is very close to Harry, Ron and Hermione, but if she was in Slytherin, in the early books at least, she wouldn't really get the chance to get that close with them. The time she's with them in the common room, well, they just wouldn't happen. When she sat with them in the Great Hall during the feasts, when everyone sits with their houses, she wouldn't be sat with them then either. The interaction she has with Harry and Ron in Quidditch in the later years, none of those would happen. And that's not to say they couldn't get close if she's not Gryffindor, because they befriend Luna and she's a Ravenclaw. But there's just something a little bit different about Slytherin, isn't there? For example, Luna gets close to the trio because of the DA, but there aren't any Slytherins in the DA at all. In fact, the Slytherins tend to join the Inquisitorial Squad with Umbridge to try and stop the DA from happening. And so if Ginny were in the DA, sharing a common room with the Inquisitorial Squad, feels like that might be a sticky situation, particularly if Draco Malfoy were to corner her in Slytherin common room. At that point, not only is he popular and has a lot of sway with the other Slytherins, but he's also a prefect, so he could make her life in Slytherin pretty miserable, but more on that later in the video. So Draco being Harry's main rival, Draco displaying anti-Muggleborn tendencies, Draco being proud that his father is a Death Eater. If we assume that Ginny's personality doesn't change much despite being sorted into Slytherin, well then the two of them sharing a common room would make an interesting dynamic indeed. Because Ginny would be fond of Harry and she's not exactly one to bite her tongue, particularly if Malfoy were to make jokes about Harry. And then if he made slurs about Muggleborns, Ginny would probably stand up for them. Or would she? If Ginny's core circumstances at Hogwarts no longer saw her being surrounded by Gryffindors, and instead her downtime was spent with people like Malfoy, Crabbe and Goyle, not specifically those people, but similar people to them, and that happens a lot in the books, all Slytherins are grouped together as having similar mentalities. If those were the people she spent most of her downtime with in Hogwarts, would she grow into the kind of person who would stand up for those less able to stand up for themselves? It's the old nature versus nurture argument, and it's really hard to say. But if she were to still be the same sort of person, and she were to stand up for the people who deserved standing up for, it would kind of be like the interactions we have in Gryffindor common room between Hermione and Fred. Hermione telling Fred he can't test his puking pastels on unwitting first years, but way more weighted because it's about prejudice and anti-Muggleborn mentalities. I know the story is sort of told from Harry's perspective, so we'd never see them, but they'd still be interesting interactions to hear about. Now, we've touched on this a little bit, but the Tom Riddle diary plot becomes way more significant with Ginny as a Slytherin. Firstly, the fact that Riddle's diary and the Chamber of Secrets are all to do with Slytherin makes Ginny, as a Slytherin now, far more of a significant choice for Tom Riddle to try and possess. Not only because of the link to Slytherin and Tom Riddle as Slytherin's heir, but also when Ron finds out Ginny's the one who opened the Chamber of Secrets, he'd start to have an existential crisis. Because he'll assume Ginny is the heir of Slytherin, which by extension would make him and all of his brothers also the heirs of Slytherin. And I really think seeing Ron go through that existential crisis in the lead up to the climax of the Chamber of Secrets would be such a cool plot. Such a cool little moment to see him panicking about it. Of course focused on saving his sister first, but worried about his heritage secondly. But also in the Chamber of Secrets we have Harry, who's a Gryffindor feeling like maybe he should have been a Slytherin, and Ginny being a Slytherin feeling like she ought to have been a Gryffindor like the rest of her family. The two of them sort of moving on the same path, just in opposite directions. There's a lot of circle theory in Harry Potter, a lot of symmetry to the plots, which I'll make another video about later, and so those two doing that sort of dance with opposite circumstances just feels so fitting to the series. Beyond all of that though, we have Riddle's diary. If Ginny was a Slytherin, she'd have so much more to emotionally unload onto the memory of Tom Riddle. The only daughter with 6 brothers, having a crush on Harry who doesn't notice her, then being the first Weasley in a generation or two at least to be sorted not into Gryffindor, the feeling of being a letdown to her family, an outsider to them all. And not only an outsider to them, but an outsider to her house as well. Because the Weasleys are the biggest blood traitors in the wizarding world. A blood traitor in Slytherin would kind of struggle to make friends. So of course, she'd have a lot to open up to Riddle's diary about. And that makes her possession by the diary even deeper and even more significant. But in turn, that gives her more room to grow. So after she's been possessed by Voldemort, the only way for Ginny is up. And we see by her character growth in the series as we know it, that by the Order of the Phoenix she is confident, she is competent, she is popular, and even more so than in the Half-Blood Prince. And I think that glow up from Ginny, that character development, it would be even more significant if she had spent her time at Hogwarts as a Slytherin. If she spent her entire first 2 years trying to make friends from Slytherin but failing because they want nothing to do with her, being outcasted by her Slytherin peers, well, by her later years, Ginny wouldn't care. She'd befriend Luna, she'd befriend Neville because they're kind of outcasts too. And so at that point, she would grow into almost exactly the character she grows into anyway. Standing up for herself, standing up for others, standing up to people like Malfoy and Crabbe and Goyle and Blaise and Pansy. And then we would have so much opportunity for great moments. Seeing Ginny make the Quidditch team and coming to blows with Malfoy. Maybe, oh God, I'd love this, if she became the Quidditch captain and she kicked him off the team, or she refused his father's bribes to keep him there. And all of these little moments would build up to her maybe being the only Slytherin to join Dumbledore's army. So with Ron's uncertainty around his Slytherin sister, I think Ginny joining the DA would be a really interesting subplot in the Order of the Phoenix. Because on the one hand, everyone would be really nervous about the only Slytherin who wants to join the DA, but on the other hand, Ginny would make the point that, well, she's never going to join the Death Eaters, especially after her possession by Tom Riddle just a couple of years earlier. And because of all of that, now that Voldemort is back, she needs to defend herself. And Umbridge's lessons aren't helping her as much as they're not helping anybody else. If she's already friends with Luna and Neville, that would carry some weight too. And so I can imagine this impassioned speech from her, making her case as to why she should be allowed to join, when someone like Justin Finch-Fletchley or Zachariah Smith is saying, no, you're a Slytherin. And I think that would be really cool for the plot, having those inter-house politics within the DA, especially when the rest of her house are then recruited to the Inquisitorial Squad to try and find out and shut down the DA. And Malfoy would know Ginny was in the group. And I'd love to hear or see instances of him trying to corner her to get information about Dumbledore's army, and then when he tries to intimidate her, she uses the spell she's learning in the DA to hex him out of her way. And then in the scene where the Inquisitorial Squad does get to Dumbledore's army because Marietta Edgecombe had the information pulled out of her, everyone would think it was Ginny. And all of this progress she seemed to be making and fitting in with everyone would sort of come undone. until she helps them break free from Umbridge's office, goes with them to the Ministry and fights the Death Eaters alongside them. Which is when everyone's reservations about her are completely broken down. And then when she's accepted by the others, she can maybe start to influence her own house. Make it better from the inside. Ginny's strong moral compass, accompanied by how strong and popular she is, well, I think that once she gets into her 5th year and she's more comfortable with who she is as a person, finally feeling like she has a support system, and finally finished fighting the fact that she's a Slytherin. Try saying that sentence 5 times fast. When you pair her finally being accepted by everyone with the fact that Slughorn is now at Hogwarts as an example of another Slytherin who's not entirely evil, well, I think she'd have a really positive influence on Slytherin House. People like Malfoy and Pansy and Crabbe and Goyle are too far gone, sure. But the other Slytherins? Maybe some of the younger ones who need a good role model? I like to think that with her influence and her example, maybe we'd have a few more Slytherins joining the rebellion in the Deathly Hallows. A few more of them standing up to Malfoy, and maybe even a few more of them standing up to Snape. So as a Weasley in Slytherin, Ginny would have an interesting relationship with Professor Snape. On the one hand, Snape may be more lenient with her than he is with her Gryffindor siblings because she's in his house, and he's always given favouritism to people in Slytherin. But she's also popular, intelligent, pretty, red-haired, very strong-willed, and she's starting to sound a little bit like one Lily Evans that we know Snape had a soft spot for. Or leaning slightly more towards an obsession than just a soft spot, but you get the point. But on the other hand, she's still a Weasley. She's still close to Harry, who Snape hates. And frankly, she wouldn't put up with Snape berating and torturing literal children when he's supposed to be their teacher, especially as she gets older, more self-assured. So maybe Snape would be slightly lenient to her because she's in his house, wouldn't want to take away too many points from her. But when she starts telling him to stop threatening certain students' toads with poison, well, I think he'd start to get a bit defensive, and then he'd start treating her like he treats every other student who's not in Slytherin. Every other student who dares to stand up to him, which means badly. He'd treat her badly. So the Second Wizarding War would roll around, and before the events of the Order of the Phoenix, before Ginny joined the DA, before she fought in the Ministry alongside Ron, Harry, Hermione, Neville and Luna, Ginny may still be treading on eggshells as the only Weasley who's in Slytherin. So having her at Grimmauld Place, around Sirius in particular, who is notoriously anti-Slytherin because of his family, especially since that's the dawn of the Order of the Phoenix and they need to start planning their defense against Voldemort, knowing full well that Ginny is going to go and share a common room with Draco Malfoy for a year might be quite an awkward, touchy summer. Through no fault of Ginny's, of course. But after the Order of the Phoenix plays out, after Ginny has proved she's a pick-me Slytherin, she's not like all the other Slytherins, well, I think her fighting the Death Eaters at the Ministry alongside the DA and the Order, that would probably count as her proving herself, right? And so her role in the Second Wizarding War, most notably heading up that rebellion at Hogwarts with Neville and Luna, well, I think that would continue in exactly the same way in the Deathly Hallows, except that with her influence over certain Slytherin students, maybe we'd see more of a sympathetic contingent of Slytherin students joining the rebellion as well. With Ginny's influence, maybe they'd side with Harry over Voldemort. And speaking of Harry, there is one more big thing we need to address about Ginny's change of circumstances. Would Ginny and Harry still end up together? Well, Ginny ends up in the same place eventually, fighting the good fight for the right cause. But without those evenings in the common room, getting close to Ron, Harry and Hermione, building a friendship first, without Harry seeing her competency on the Quidditch pitch, which is something he really admires because they're in the same Quidditch team, would they still have the foundations of a relationship blossom? Well, maybe, yeah. I mean, the relationship they end up having starts probably in the Order of the Phoenix. That's when they start to get much closer as friends. When Harry starts seeing her as her own competent, self-assured witch, as opposed to just Ron's little sister. And since we've already established that Ginny would almost certainly still join the DA, Harry would still start to see that side of her. In fact, maybe he'd see it more abruptly since he hasn't been spending any real time with her until now. And then he'd still see her at the Burrow in the summers, and then at the Slug Club. And maybe it would take them a little longer to get together. And it may be even more taboo because she's a Slytherin, although she's his best friend's little sister, so how much more taboo can it really get? Either way, I think they might still get together, but would they have gotten together had Ron died in the Philosopher's Stone in that chess match where he sacrifices himself? How would that change Harry and Ginny's relationship, but also the entire dynamic of the Harry Potter series? Well, I made this video breaking that entire scenario down, so if you want to find out, you'll want to watch that one next, and believe me, it changes a lot more than you'd think.